Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bold Explorer reading. I haven't done this for 2 days, and suddenly it feels very different. It feels like I've been away for ages. Hello, good afternoon to the lovely Julia. Good afternoon to Ed Loud. Thank you for joining me again. We are continuing with chapter 3 of I Saw Two Englands by H.V. Morton. It does feel weird coming back into here. I'd be now. Is this today? Yes, it is today. Hello, Linda Kane. It's Monday. It is Monday, isn't it? I know. Feels very strange. Good afternoon to Michael Angel. Nice to see you there. Thank you for coming along. I did wonder if people had forgotten all about me. The lovely Julia remembered because she sent me a text message before we start to say good luck. So thank you very much, Julia. That's very kind of you. Also to make sure that I'd remembered myself. I have been busy out filming filming and editing to get these In Search of Sussex videos done. And I can tell you they are so different in the process, so much more time consuming in the process to get them than the normal videos that I was doing in the Quest for England, although they can be quite time consuming. I'm on the move and the gear is a lot lighter. I'm using bigger gear, bigger tripod, and I just so exhausted. Anyway, but they seem to be going down well. People seem to be liking them, and I do prefer locked off shots and nice footage and spending the time to make it. We could talk about this on another live, I think. Maybe I'll do a live show about the production and stuff. Because I think countryside should be filmed sumptuously, particularly at the moment. Anyway, nice to see you all. Welcome back. Good afternoon, says Mike Stevens. Hello to you. Mark Johnny McLeod, good afternoon to you. Graham Roffey. Hello. Now, if I remember rightly, we were going to reenact the death scene of Thomas à Becket, and I'm hoping I can read as I did before, entertainingly. Sorry about the noise. I don't know if you can hear the noise on this chair. Every time I move, it's making funny old noise. Right. So, we left him with this sentence. And now, I said to Mr. Wood, let us go to the cathedral and try to imagine exactly what happened on the night of December the 29th in the year 1170. We're at Canterbury Cathedral, if you remember rightly. Filmed lovingly. It is, you say that, filmed lovingly. I think if you're behind the scenes watching me film, you witness a muttering man going around talking to himself, thinking, oh, that'd be a nice shot. Maybe if I drop the camera down there and film through those cow parsley, and I'll just do a picture of my legs going along here, or I'll get this. Or otherwise, you'll hear this man going, oh, bloody people, come on, get out the way. Move, will you? Not to them, obviously, but quietly to myself. People cycle. Oh, now there's a blooming cyclist coming. Right, we'll have to wait for him. Right now I'm standing around looking like I'm very suspicious, waiting for a cyclist to pass, and you wait for this. Yes, good morning. The cyclist in the middle of nowhere, riding through the countryside with a mask on. With a mask on. It's like, in the old days, when people used to ride through the country with a mask on, they usually had a gun and would say, stand and deliver. This one, it's like, oh, I might get something from you. Yeah, you might do. Anyway, enough of this gay banter. My plants rejoice for rain, do they? That's it. Blame the chair. I'm going to blame the chair. Right, here we go. Civilized human beings are rarely in the habit of falling into ungovernable rages, of biting the carpet in fury and exhibiting other signs well known in badly constructed nurseries. Do you know what that meant? I have no idea what I've just read. But in earlier times, our kings and nobles were not ashamed to give such violent exhibitions. They would roll on the floor, snapping at the rushes like dogs. They would scream, they would rave, they would weep tears of fury, and then the mood would pass, and like naughty children, they would sometimes be sorry. Do you think that's true? Can you imagine kings and nobles rolling on the floor? The men of that time were neither ashamed nor amused by such scenes. When Richard of Devizes described how Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard Coeur de Lion, however you want to say, Lionheart, had ranted and shouted and had champed his teeth the pine rod. What? And champed with his teeth the pine rod which he held in his hand, he compared this childish display with his noble rage of a lion. On a night towards the end of December in the year 1170, King Henry II of England, who was then at the castle of Burr, near Bayeux, fell into one of these royal rages. The cause of his anger was the action of Thomas of Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, who for 18 years had been fighting the state's attempt to dominate the church. The king loathed Becket, as only an autocrat can loathe an equally strong rival. And what perhaps made their relationship even worse was that before Becket had entered the church, he had been a gay man of the world. Different terminology of gay man of the world there, I think. And the king's favourite. It is well known that no people can fight more bitterly than old friends. Henry had forced Becket to be Archbishop against his will, because he wished to have a complacent friend at the head of the church. Wait a minute. Henry had forced Becket to be Archbishop against his will because he wished to have a complacent friend at the head of the church he wished to attack. Oh, at the church he wished to attack. But he had chosen the wrong man. No sooner was Becket consecrated than he ceased to be the king's man and became God's man. And from that moment, and for 18 years, the story of England is the fight between the church and the state, between Becket and Henry. On that night in December, Henry worked himself into a frightful paroxysm. He called Becket a fellow that came to court on a lame horse with a cloak for a saddle. He said that a man he had loathed with benefits was insulting him, and then turning to the assembled courtiers, he shouted, "What sluggard wretches, what cowards have I brought up in my court, who care for nothing for their allegiance to their master? Will no one deliver me from this low-born priest?" He rushed from the hall. Like that. Ed Loud, let's just go to some of the comments as we go. Ed Loud says, "I wish to get out more today. Sadly, the roof collapsed in my kitchen. Oh my. Water damage from the flat upstairs ruined my breakfast and bread. Holy mackerel." Ben Reeves says, "I remember a few years ago, cyclists in London stopped, pulled down their mask and lit a cigarette." A few years ago. Graham Rock, have we been in this limbo with COVID for years now? Michael Angel says, "I was glad you liked the Bald Explorer cartoon." Oh yes, I must show that to people. The Bald Explorer cartoon is fantastic. Thank you so much. I must work out where to put it in. Mark, I showed it to Julia. She loved it. Mark Donny McLeod said, "Oh my God, Ed, you get those things sorted." Julia says, "Oh no, MDM and Ed." Mike Stevens says, "Are you?" Oh, yeah, talking about all of that. No bread for making, blah, blah, blah. No bread making. Okay. Linda Kane, oh dear. Yeah, I think the damage. Yeah, thanks for that. You just ruined the reading. You're all talking about blooming Ed's kitchen. I know, it's a shame. I'm only joking. Anyway, you just talk amongst yourselves. I'll just carry on. Don't worry about me. Will no one deliver me from this low-born priest? He rushed from the hall. That night, 4 men crossed the channel. Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Richard de Breton and Hugh de Morville. They crossed by different routes. 2 arrived at Dover and 2 at Winchelsea. They rode to Saltwood Castle near Canterbury, which was held by one of Becket's enemies, Dan Rudolph de Brock, and there, in a darkened room, they discussed a plan of action. It was the 28th of December. Dun, dun, dun. Yeah. As I stood in the north transept of Canterbury Cathedral, at the place where Becket died, I thought I would try and write a plain account of his murder, rejecting all fable and fancy, and using only the facts supplied by men who saw it happen and who were alive at the time. The murder of the Archbishop is one of the best documented events in medieval history. He was slain in the Fleet Street of his time, if I may be forgiven the comparison, surrounded by the only reporters of the age, the monks and priests of the church. Some who stood behind him, some who ran away and hid, others who vested his corpse for burial have left descriptions from which it's possible to paint a true picture of that night 769 years ago. I think it might be a bit longer now. Oops, says Ed Loud. Sorry, dear chap, was enjoying your reading, but I'm holding up my kitchen roof by my hands and trying to protect my bread. There we go. Apparently, even in the 1980s, artex on the ceiling could contain asbestos. Yeah, you tell me about it. In 1930s, they certainly did. We had them in my dad's bungalow. Anyway, we're not getting anywhere with this reading. In addition to the many contemporary narratives, there are no fewer than 5 eyewitness accounts of Becket's death. The account of William of Canterbury, a monk, William Fitzstephen, a clerk in attendance on Becket, Benedict, another monk who was there, John of Salisbury, and I've lost my space, there he is, and Edward Grimm, a clerk of Cambridge, who was on a visit to Becket at the time. I'd love to be called Edward Grimm. And now the tales of Edward Grimm. Mind you, the Grimm, what were they called? The Brothers Grimm, I suppose. Yeah, they've already beaten me to it. On the 29th of December, the day after the 4 knights crossed the Channel, at 3 in the afternoon, Becket sat down to dinner in the hall of the Archbishop's place, which was separated by the cathedral by the great cloister. He sat at the high table with his household, and the monks, while at the long table sat the poor people. While at the long table sat the poor people and beggars whom he entertained every day. The floor was covered with fresh hay. The smoke of burning logs ascended through the hall, and the grey light of a December afternoon shone beyond the narrow windows. At the end of the dinner, after a thanksgiving had been sung, Becket went to his retiring room, and the servants flung themselves on the broken meats. The sound was heard of horses clattering into the courtyard. In a few moments 4 knights in ordinary dress strode into the hall through the crowds of departing beggars. The servants asked the visitors would they like something to eat, but they refused and went to Becket's room. The Archbishop, seated on a couch, was leaning on the shoulder of a monk, while monks reclined on the floor near him. He was over 6 feet in height, handsome, with a keen and piercing eye. He was 52 years of age, and though his figure was really spare, he felt the cold so acutely that he wore an incredible number of garments in order to keep warm, and these gave him a padded, corpulent appearance. As the knights entered, he continued to talk with the monk next to him. They came in silently, without a greeting, and sat on the floor at his feet. Then Becket looked at them and spoke to Tracy by name. The knights began to talk violently. They charged Becket with undermining the royal authority and causing disturbances, and they demanded that he should lift the ban of excommunication from the bishops of London and Salisbury. Becket, who was a man of quick temper, also raised his voice, and soon knights and archbishops were quarrelling violently. The knights flew into one of their Norman passions and stamped about the room, twisting their long gauntlets, advancing close to Becket, gnashing their teeth and waving their arms. Where the hell? I do that and then I lose my space. They screamed. Then he threatened to execute them. Then they screamed, and he threatened to excommunicate them. He shouted back that they could not frighten him. Were all the swords of England hanging over my head? Were all the swords of England hanging over my head, he shouted, you could not terrify me from my obedience to God and my Lord the Pope. Crowds of monks and servants ran into the room, gathered around Becket. The knights roared at them to stand back if they were loyal to the king. They refused to move. The room was soon a pandemonium, and through it the knights ran to the door, shouting, "To arms! To arms!" They've only got 2 arms, you see. That's all they had. They were just going, "To arms! To arms!" If only they were octopi. It was now nearly 5 o'clock. The winter's darkness had fallen. Beneath the sycamore tree in the courtyard, the knights put on their armour. The monks bolted the doors, and Becket sat down again on the couch. He was watching a bit of daytime television, I think. "It is wonderful, my lord," said John of Salisbury, "that you would never take anyone's advice." "I am prepared to die," replied Becket stubbornly. Some of the monks, discussing the scene together, believed there was nothing to fear because, as William Fitzstephen noted, the men had come drunk, and they would have spoken like that before dinner. Others would not have spoken like that before dinner. Others were not so sanguine. At this moment, a frightened monk rushed in to say the knights were arming. All, save a few companions, fled to the cathedral. All monks are cowards," said Becket. His attendants, believing that the knights would not dare shed blood on consecrated ground, forced Becket against his will to leave the palace His attendants, believing that the knights would not dare to shed blood on consecrated... His attendants, believing that the knights would not dare to shed blood on consecrated ground, forced Becket against his will to leave the palace. Half pushed, half lifted, he was taken through the cloisters into the dark church where Vespers had just begun. That's not monk on those bikes, is it? That's a Vesper, isn't it? Those motorcycles, those mopeds. That's a Vesper. Can you imagine them going round? Sorry, get back to it. Where Vespers had just begun. As they gained what some of them hoped was sanctuary, they heard behind them the crash of woodwork as the knights broke into the palace. What then happened took place in almost complete darkness, a darkness lit only by tapers burning before the shrines. A hammering echo through the church. Becket ordered the doors to be opened, and when no one would do it, he strode forward and himself flung back the bars. A terrified crowd of monks fought to enter. Becket helped them, saying, come in, faster, faster." By this time the church was full of flying and hiding men. Only 3 remained with the Archbishop: Robert of Morton, William Fitzstephen, his chaplain, and Edward Grimm, the clerk. I'll say that again. Edward Grimm, the clerk. "You're doomed, Captain Mannering. Thomas a Becket, you're doomed, Thomas a Becket." "None of the Becket, if you don't mind," said Thomas. Yes, Edward Grimm. "They tried to get Becket to hide in the crypt or in the triforium, where he would never have been discovered, but he declined to do so. At last they persuaded him to mount the steps from the north transept in which they were standing to the choir, but as they did so the knights, covered to the eyes in chain mail, broke into the church. Fitzurse came first with a sword in one hand and a carpenter's axe which he had picked up in the palace in the other. He could see nothing in the darkness and stood calling, "Traitor, Becket!" There was silence. He called again, and then Becket came down the stairs. "Reginald, why do you come into my church armed?" he asked. Fitzurse replaced the carpenter's axe against Becket's. Fitzurse placed the carpenter's axe against Becket's chest and said, "You shall die. I shall tear out your heart." "I am ready to die," replied Becket, "for God and the church. But I warn you, I curse you in the name of Almighty God if you do not let my men escape." The knights, fearing to commit sacrilege, then tried to hustle Becket out of the church. "I will not fly, you detestable fellow," he shouted, pushing Fitzurse away. Then they tried to place him on Tracy's shoulders, but Becket seized Tracy and flung him into the floor. He flung him roughly to the floor. And at that moment Fitzurse came up with a lifted sword, and Becket, now furious, cried out, You, word I can't pronounce, wretch, you are my man. You have done me fealty. You ought not touch me. The word I couldn't profligate. You profligate wretch, he said. You are my man. You have done me fealty. You ought not touch me. Fitzurse shouted back, I owe you no fealty or homage. Contrary to my fealty, and words of that ilk. I owe you no fealty or homage, contrary to my fealty to the king, and he made a blow at Becket's head. It did not touch him, but knocked his skull cap to the ground. Ping! Tracy then came up. Tracy came up and aimed a blow, which the clerk, Grim, "You're doomed," who had his arm around Becket, tried to parry. The blow cut Grim's arm and grazed the crown of Becket's head, and also cut into his shoulder. "My arm is doomed." Sorry, I am mucking about a little bit here, but you were talking about the roof. "For the name of Jesus and the defence of the church, I am ready to die," whispered Becket. "For the name of Jesus and the defence of the church." I wish that when they do this, he whispered. They would put that at the beginning, not at the end, because there you are, proclaiming it nice and loudly, only to discover the bloody fool whispered it. "For the name of Jesus and the defence of the church, I am ready to die," whispered Becket. And with these words, he fell flat on his face. Richard de Breton stood over him and delivered a tremendous blow which severed the top of his skull. Bing! So violent a blow that the sword snapped as it met the marbled floor. Hugh of Horsey, a subdeacon who had joined the murderers, was then taunted with having taken no part in the murder. He came up and thrust his sword into the wound, scattering Becket's brains all over the pavement. You can buy a big packet of Becket's brains, actually, at Canterbury Cathedral. It's about $9.99, but they are very nice with pork scratchings. So, with Becket newly slain to the floor of the church, of his own church, the murderers, beside themselves with rage and triumph, ran through the cloisters shouting, "The King's men! The King's men!" as if they had been in battle, for that was the war cry of the English. And as they rode away, a thunderstorm of great violence broke over Canterbury, striking terror into the hearts of people. Really? I don't know that would have happened. But obviously the witnesses went, "Oh, a thunderstorm, look, write it down." That night a strange scene took place before the high altar. The monks undressed the body of Becket for burial. They took off the incredible assortment of garments which covered him, first a brown mantle, then a white surplice, then a long coat of lamb's wool, then 2 woolen pelsises, whatever they might be, then, to add utter astonishment, a black robe of a Benedictine monk. At the sight of it, their grief and emotion knew no bounds. It astounded them to think that the Archbishop, whom they had regarded as a great noble, fond of purple and fine linen, should have secretly assumed a monk's habit. "See what a true monk he was, and we knew not of anything of it," they sobbed. "Oh, see what a true monk he was, and we knew it not." See, they did it again. They put it at the end. Instead, they should have said, they sobbed. See, that's what they should have done. It doesn't help people like me reading this out. A great surprise awaited them. It was Cilla Black. No. When they stripped the body, they saw that Becket wore a hair shirt. Not a share hurt. I can't do it now. I can't do it. I can't read it. I can't cope. First day back to this reading after 2 days off, and I'm in tatters. Yes, when they stripped the body, they saw that Becket wore a hair shirt next to his skin, and beneath it was his body was marked with weals of scourging. So he was more austere a monk than any of them. Oh my God, what a nutter. What a nutter. Then they saw a thing which is nauseating to our minds today, but in those days proved beyond doubt that a man had subdued the flesh and humiliated the body in order that his soul might shine. They saw that Becket's hair shirt crawled with vermin. Their joy and amazement at this revolting sight were boundless, and they cried, as indeed I imagine a Coptic monk of Egypt crying today, "He was one of God's saints." On that very night, he died with a few hours of his martyrdom. On that very night, he died within a few hours of his martyrdom. Thomas à Becket was hailed as Saint Thomas of Canterbury. The townspeople who had filled the cathedral during the murder fought for pieces of his attire and, washing the bloodstains, took them away as sacred relics. Miracles were reported almost at once. No one can say that they were invented by the monks, because the cathedral, having been desecrated, was closed for a year. The altars were stripped, the crucifixes were veiled, the bells were silenced, and the offices were conducted in the chapter house without chanting. Indeed, there was every reason why the monks were desperately anxious to hush up the growing cult of St. Thomas, for fear that the king and the terrible Randolph of Brock, who had seized the high bishop's palace and was their next-door neighbour, I came to the end, unexpectedly came to an end of the sentence. Wait a minute, what is that? Indeed, there was every reason why the monks were desperately anxious to hush up the growing cult of St. Thomas, for fear of the king and the terrible Randolph of Thing, who had seized the what's-it. The measures taken to hush up these miracles from motives of fear and policy, and the failure to do so, is one of the most curious stories in the history of medieval pilgrimage. Despite every discouragement, crowds of people began to visit Canterbury, to pray at Becket's tomb, to touch his garments, or to apply an afflicted portions of the body water. Or to apply to afflicted portions of the body water in which the Archbishop's blood had been mixed. The wave of horror that had swept over Christendom was succeeded by a feeling of amazement and wonder when stories of the cures and miracles began to get about. The Pope was delighted. No, he wasn't. The Pope was obliged to send a legation to England to inquire into them. They took back control. No, that was Boris Johnson. They took back with them part of a tunic stained with Becket's blood, a fragment of his brain, and some portions of the pavement on which he died, relics which are still preserved in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. The result of the inquiry was the canonisation of Becket 3 years after his murder and the appointment of 29th of December as the Feast of St. Thomas of Canterbury. There was now no further need for concealment. Canterbury became one of the great pilgrimage shrines in Europe. Churches dedicated to St. Thomas sprang up in Christian countries all over the world, and 4 years after the murder, a wonder-stricken but approving world heard that Henry II, barefoot and in sackcloth, had gone on foot to Canterbury to be scourged at Becket's tomb. The tomb was in the crypt where the monks had hurriedly buried the martyr the day after the murder. A strong wall of hewn stone roof with marble had been built around the tomb, with 2 openings in either side, so that a pilgrim might kneel down and, placing his head through one of the openings, bend forward and kiss the sarcophagus. It was in this humble posture, and clothed only in a hair shirt, that Henry II offered his penance. On his knees and with his head inside the cover of the tomb, he received upon his back 5 strokes of a rod from every bishop and abbot present, and 3 from each of the 80 monks. After this ordeal, he spent the night bruised and fasting upon the floor of the crypt, and in the morning, after the early mass, he went his way to London, taking with him, as all pilgrims did for centuries to come, a small leaden phial full of the miraculous water. Blimey. So, just be careful what you wish for. Will no one rid me of this? No, don't do that. So, anyway, that was that. Where are we doing on time? Whew, Struth. That's time for a glass of water, I think. Let's see if anybody's still alive at the end of all of that. What are we talking about here? Let's just go back and have a look at some of the messages, ladies and gentlemen, that have come up. Oops, Becket got that wrong in a big way. Yes. I like that bit. Sounds like a cat singing. Yes, that's it. Becket was more a Lamberetta man than a Vesper guy. Oh, is that right? Is that right? Yeah. You could see him in the back in the cloisters tuning up. And away he goes. He had an axe to grind, poor bugger, didn't he? This is Becket as played by Alistair Sim and the Night Lord Blackadder. Life of Brian reference is good. There we go. All I can think of is John Cleese in Monty Python's Life of Brian saying, "And throw him roughly to the floor." Yes, well, that was what that was. I really don't think Richard is taking this seriously. I am. It's very serious. This is H.V. Morton we're talking about. Hi, Richard and everybody. It's wonderful. Just logged on. Hello, K.D. Nice to see you. Roughly thrown. I think it was roughly thrown. I didn't know until recently Chris Langham was in the Life of Brian. Langham? Release Richard from his weedings. Release Richard from his weedings. He's read far too much. Poor old Thomas. His attackers weren't very brave. No, they weren't very brave. They were dressed up in all their stuff. They could barely see out of the thing. I didn't realise that. I've heard some of these monks have bad habits. What? Good afternoon. Yes, blah, 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 la, la, la. Let's get to the end. No cycling today. No cycling today, 'cause my lover is away. How does the song go? No cycling today. So strange. I was telling my brother about these events when we were walking on the old road to Canterbury only the other day. Deja vu. No Daz back then. Right, so there we go. Sorry about the if you I thought the Cilla Black reference was funny. You probably don't get it. Anyway, surprise, surprise. What a lot of laughs. I once did a... Do you remember Surprise, Surprise? I once did a Surprise, Surprise Cilla Black's series. I once was involved in that. Somebody wanted to ride a unicycle. I never met Cilla Black, But I had to be the one. They go to the VT, the videotape, as they used to call it, and they would go, "Oh, we got another laugh here," and then she introduced this woman. Well, I had to go there and teach them how to ride a unicycle, and they filmed a bit of me showing this woman how to ride a unicycle. I never saw the end programme, though. I don't know how much they saw of me. It was just a load of old rubbish. No news today. My brother's gone away. Oh, yes, that's right. No cycling today. I've got to bring in the hay. It was a privilege to go round the cathedral with Mr. Wood, who knows every stone of the building. He showed me the place in the crypt where Becket was buried before the magnificent retro choir behind the high altar was constructed to hold the relics. 50 years to the day after the martyr's death, his remains were taken up from the crypt in a chest full of white flowers and placed in a shrine behind the high altar, which became one of the wonders of Christendom. The piety of kings, nobles, and common folk covered the shrine with gifts until it seemed to be one ablaze of gold and precious stones. Resting on arches of masonry, the shrine was covered by a wooden canopy, which would be drawn up on ropes towards the roof. As it slowly rose, pulled upwards by the monk, the tinkling of silver bells attached to it warned pilgrims all over the church that the martyr's shrine was being shown. As the blaze of gold and jewels came into sight, the pilgrims fell upon their knees, while the prior, pointing with a white wand, described the valued ruby, diamond, and emerald in English and France. You see there the lovely diamond. It is the invaluable. Also, we have an emerald. It's so nice too. I have some onions around my shoulders and a tonsil in my tonsils. The shrine was dismissed by the relics removed. The shrine was dismantled and the relics removed by order of Henry VIII. Several cartloads of treasure were taken away, but one jewel, the great regal of France, Henry VIII, reserved for his own use. This was a ruby or a diamond of extraordinary size, the gift of Louis VII. Henry made it into a ring, which he wore on his thumb. What happened to the bones of Becket has always been a mystery ever since. There's no actual proof that they were buried, as some have believed. Neither is there positive proof that the monks buried them secretly before the commissioners destroyed the shrine. A great sensation was caused in Canterbury in 1888 when workmen discovered in the crypt, not far from Becket's first tomb, a stone coffin containing the bones of a tall man. The skull appeared to have been smashed by a battle-axe or a sword. Were they the bones of Becket? They were photographed, and you can buy the photographs of them in Canterbury today for sixpence, and the skeleton was put together by competent anatomists, and no definite conclusion was ever reached about it. I wonder if a conclusion has ever been reached since then. The bones were replaced in the coffin and, together with a sealed bottle containing a photograph of the skull and a record of the discovery, reburied in the same place in the crypt where they lie today. I went off one morning to see the almshouses at St. Nicholas's, about 1.5 miles out of Canterbury, on the Faversham Road. They stand on top of a steep bank which commands the most typical piece of Kent you could wish to see. It has everything in it. It looks as though an artist has grouped in a small space more of Kent than nature would have dared to do, even in her most exuberant moments. In the foreground are oast houses. Beyond them, in the ground falls away to rise opposite in slopes which are neatly planted with orchards with the regiments of hops. To the left, chalk downs are folded one against another, ridged with trees, and among them, I think, are belts of typical black yews. If an artist wished to paint a picture called Kent, all he would have to do All he would have to do would be to take his paint box to the almshouses of St. Nicholas and put down what he saw in front of him. The almshouses themselves make a lovely foreground to this panorama. The old grey church stands on the top of the bank, and the ground then slides steeply towards two groups of little grey cottages, each one with a bright front garden. Like all almshouses, the place is quiet and reposed. You know that youth is finally excluded, but flowers and young birds come gaily into this retreat, invading autumn with something of spring's beauty. There was no one to be seen as I stood there, until a baker's boy came whistling down the path and delivered a loaf to an old woman who has sat to Rembrandt many a time. Then I don't know what you mean by that. There was no one. He came whistling down the path and delivered a loaf to an old woman who has sat to Rembrandt many a time. Then two old men appeared with a lawn-mower and advanced on the curved slope of grass. One old man was unbelievably smart. He wore a bowler hat and a winged collar and a tie and grey cotton gloves. His friend had a piece of string which he attached to the front of the mower in order to assist the machine uphill. I watched them for some time and thought how strange it was to see an old man mowing grass in a bowler hat and gloves. He was, I thought, some old pensioner who lived all his life in a town, probably some small shopkeeper of Canterbury, noted for his tidiness and sobriety, and he'd carried the outward symbols of rectitude with him to the grey almshouses on Harbledown Hill. "Good morning," I called when they came near me. "A notice on the door says that the sub-prior will show the almshouses to visitors. Will you tell me where I can find him?" The old man in the gloves gave me a friendly smile, and gladly, I thought, left the lawn-mower. "I am the sub-prior," he said. "I will show you the place. Let's have a look at the church first of all, shall we?" I'd made him somewhat sinister and a bit weird. I don't know whether he is, but he sounds weird. Any man in a bowler hat mowing the lawn must be a little bit weird. "Hello, come with me. Come with me. My name is Donald Pleasance. Come with me." I don't know whether Donald Pleasance ever said that, but it's the sort of thing I can imagine he might have once said. Didn't he say, "Look, I can see my spectacles"? Didn't he say, I can see perfectly. Look, there's a pin over there." From The Great Escape. Anyway, just thought I'd mention it. So we climbed the steep bank together and approached the church of St. Nicholas. I thought it delightful that these old people should live under the protection of the patron saint of children. We entered the church, which is in parts the same building put up in 1084 by William the Conqueror's friend, Lanfranc. When he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He built it then as the chapel of a leper settlement, and I think I'm right in saying that this was the first leper hospital in England. It is still a fine old church and has not been injured by earnest restorers. There's some early Norman carving on the capitals, some beautiful early glass, and a grand open wooden roof. The peculiarity of the building is that the pavement slopes so steeply from chancel downward to the door that if you put an orange on the floor at the east end of the church, it would roll rapidly away and, if it went in a straight line, out of the church by the west door. And why do you think the floor slopes like that? Come to me. I'm sorry, I can't help it. Asked the sub-prior. I'll be serious. And why do you think the floor slopes like that? Asked the sub-prior. I don't know. Lepers. I knew he was weird. Lepers. Not slippers. Lepers, he said triumphantly. Lepers were unclean, weren't they? They were diseased, weren't they? Now then, what do they do as soon as lepers have been to the church? Do all their limbs fall off or something? Now then, what would they do as soon as lepers have been to the church? They swill the church down with water, and that is why the floor slopes to the doors, to make it easier to give it a good wash down. I don't know whether there's another church floor like this in England, but if there is, you may be sure that it was a leper's church. What have we got here, says Ed Loud. I can imagine Richard saying, pray, speak quietly. Every sound you make is exquisite agony to me, like Vincent Price when he speaks in that creepy voice. Oh, yes. Yes, that's true. Come to me, come to me. How many of you are there now? I asked in a very stilted. I say, old chap, how many of you are there now? I asked. 20. He replied. He didn't do that slightly awkward laugh. He didn't do that. I'm sure he didn't. Men and women. We. What is he then? He's a man in the bowler hat, for goodness sake. How many of you are there? I asked. 20, he replied. Men and women. We get free quarters and 12 and 6 a week. He's not one of the lepers, is he? As we went outside again, the sub-prior, he's the sub-prior, yes, began to talk about the history of the place, and an interesting history it is. Leprosy is a disease now happily absent from Europe. COVID-19 sadly isn't, but once prevalent everywhere. As the traveller in the East knows, it is still visible there in the twist. Did he say COVID-19? Sorry, I must read that bit again. As the traveller in the East knows, it is still visible there in the twisted and almost unrecognisable forms of the poor wretches who crawl about and ask for alms. And arms, no doubt, if their arms have fallen off. Although most of them are now being isolated and cared for in institutions. Yes, we know what happens when you go to an institution. In the Middle Ages, every town in England had a leper house outside the walls, for lepers were forbidden to live in towns, but they could enter them to beg, always with a wooden clapper to warn people of their unclean approach. What is a wooden clapper? I'm a leper! Don't get too near! Come on now! Help me out! There is still that, because that reminds you of the Monty Python film as well. Not that he did what I just did, just to be different. They were encountered everywhere, limping along in high leather boots, which they were made to wear. Gosh, there is still a good deal of mystery about the cause of the infection, but it seems that both rich and poor were subject to the disease in the old days. Among royal lepers, it is believed that Henry II and Henry IV. A queen of England is said to have been a leper, Adelicia of Louvain, the second wife of Henry I. It's probable that Robert the Bruce died of leprosy. So did the Bishop of London, Hugh de Auvilliers, who was the first Bishop of London appointed by William the Conqueror. The bishop was consecrated by Lanfranc in 1075. He died of leprosy 10 years after, so that Lanfranc must have known him when the disease first showed itself. No doubt he discussed it with him and became familiar with the attempts to become cured. I wonder whether this had anything to do with Lanfranc's decision to found a leper hospital. Did he first become interested in the problem of the leper through his unfortunate Bishop of London? It's not significant that he should have found... Is it not... It's like he's now turned into of the prosecutor, the counsel for the prosecution. Is it now not significant that he should have founded the leper hospital in 1084, the year before Hugh de Orville died? Is it not true that the Bishop of London was a friend of the... Is it not certain that when you crossed the road with those swords, you did kill Thomas à Becket? Is it not impossible to think that through the slit of the clothes you were wearing, the armour, you could see? Is it not essential to grasp the fact that you are the murderer? The old man unlocked the door of his little museum, which is full of peculiar relics. He went over to the window and pointed to the downs. The Pilgrims Way. Sorry, I've got the wrong voice now. I completely mucked up this reading. I'm going to stop in a minute. Have no fear. I'm going to go and take my pills. The old man, yes. The Pilgrim's Way to Canterbury crosses down that, he said, and then dips into that bit of wood there and comes up past this place. Every time the pilgrims come to Hambledown, the lepers would go out and ask for alms, and always got something, for people were very kind to lepers in the old days. He unlocked the safe and showed me a leper's collecting box. He brought out a pilgrim's flask, then produced a great and historic relic, the yellow stone from Becket's shoe. I do not know how the lepers gained possession of this relic, if it is what they claimed it to be. Still less do I know how it survived the Reformation. Throughout the Middle Ages it was so famous that all pilgrims kissed it on their way to and from Canterbury. The shoe has long since vanished, and the present occupants of St. Nicholas show the yellow stone set in a wooden mazer bowl. It was this stone which roused the anger of the Dean Colet, the founder of St. Paul's School, when he passed that way with Erasmus in 1512. As they came near, an old man tottered out and offered the upper part of a shoe bound with a brass ring. "What?" cried the angry Dean. "Do these brutes imagine that we must kiss every man's shoe? Why, by the same rule they might offer his spittle to be kissed." But Erasmus added, "For my part, I pitied the old man and gave him a small piece of money by way of consolation." Apparently that's how he spoke. After the relics had been put away, I discovered in conversation with the old man that he had reached that stage, which I suppose we will all attain sometime, when the past seems infinitely brighter than the present. Nothing was as good today as it was when he was young. I looked at his grey cotton gloves and his bowler hat and wondered what saga of shopkeeping lay behind him. Had he been a grocer or a draper? I thought somehow a draper. It was odd to see a man who had obviously never had anything to do with gardening spending his last years tending the earth with gloved hands. At last I ventured, "What did you do in the old days?" "Me? My job?" he asked. "You've heard of Dan Farrier, of course. I was his gardener." And there I think we will leave it for today, for it is far beyond my powers to read any more, ladies and gentlemen. And we are still in chapter 3, and we're still in somewhere in Kent, near Canterbury. I hope you enjoyed that slightly light-hearted reading, just to get back into it. It was melodramatic, but then Morton is melodramatic. It's just, I was. What is it when they tune into somebody? I was piping him. That's not right, but you know what I mean. I was. There's a word, isn't there? I was zoning. No, I wasn't zoning him. I was something him. Let's just quickly go through the massages, and we'll see. Leper clapper, 3 pieces of wood joined by leather and on a stick. But I would imagine you wouldn't need a clapper, as people would be able to tell. Oh, clap, clap. Oh, the leper, look, tongue comes out, ding. The Spanish Inquisition says, yes, it's that Richard, the prosecution. I have just a white fish for tea, says Turbo Stream. Nice. A rather lively reading today, and I don't know about you, lovies, but I loved it. Oh, good. Thank you, Julia. Couldn't agree more. Really enjoyed the reading. Cromwell allowed the Cavaliers to march to Totnes in full tunic because of the brave defence of the Salcombe Castle. Didn't know. Enjoyed that bit. It was... I was awake for... Oh, right. Sorry. Were you a bit dozy, Adrian? Well done, Richard. Very entertaining. I think that there's a leper window at Coombs Church. I believe there is. We couldn't get in to see it. Well done, Richard. Thank you for such a lively reading. I love the way you acted out parts and the voices you chose for them. Come to me, come to me. I need a bowler hat now. I've got a bowler hat upstairs, but I need to be the man who says, come to me, come to me. I am a gardener, a church leper. I am the one in control. A bit irreverent, but quite enjoyable, says Michael Angel. I apologise if anybody was offended by anything in today's show. Then who the hell was Daniel Ferrier? Will we ever know? He was obviously, in 80 years ago, a famous gardener. You've heard of him, have you not? Yes, I've heard of him. I was his gardener, don't you know? Maybe he was probably a golfer or something. He sounds like a golfer, doesn't he? Or a farrier. Maybe he was a farrier, who did the horse's hooves. Anyway, enough of this nonsense. I must go and put myself into a small, darkened place and ease my brain. Back again tomorrow, hopefully. Another video to watch in the morning. The second part of the new In Search of Sussex, which is less irreverent and more wandering around places. I'm in Thacombe today or tomorrow, and so that's that. And then there's the Vogue show tonight at 8 o'clock. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for your company, and it's certainly woken me up. I was a bit knackered, but now I need to sort out my din-dins. So thank you, take care, and I'll see you tomorrow. Ta-ta for now. Goodbye. You know what they say, come to me, come to me.